Let's finish up the modeling portion of our training by putting everything together and then finishing up with some cables. So I've just grouped everything for the pod cockpit here under a pod main group. And so if I go ahead and right click and say unhide all, we can show the other group that we have, which is the engine. So let's leave the pod in the center and let's take our engine and let's move it over a bit and just start to position things. So if we want to leave our pod the same size, obviously one of them needs to be changed. So the pod engine either needs to get bigger or the pod itself needs to get smaller. So let's take the engine and we'll just scale that up a bit. Okay, so maybe something like that. I'm going to pull this forward and out a bit till we get it in the correct spot here. So I think maybe something like that, although we may want to bring it up because we're going to be doing some animation and rendering with this, so we want to be able to see the pod. So we'll maybe bring this up a little bit further and maybe out a little bit more. Give it a little bit more room possibly. Okay, so now we need to add our cable. So let's go into the top view. And we just need a kind of a straight line here drawn between our cable connector, which is right up here, and then wherever we want to connect our cable to on the pod. And so I think we want to connect it kind of right in here. We may need to modify the pod a little bit to make that happen. But let's just start out by bringing in some curves here. So I want to connect up from maybe right here to right here. So we may need to give it a little bit more room so it can extend beyond the geometry that we have. So I'll just move this out a little bit. Then we'll go to create, and let's create, in this case, a NURBS curve. And we'll just do a CV curve. We'll start here. I'll turn off auto grid. I'm going to start here, and let's just bring this right over here. Okay. Now we've got a straight line, but there's no resolution inside here. So I want to modify this curve. I'll go into the sub-object and select the curve. I'm going to go all the way down to CV curve here, and there's something called rebuild. So I'll turn on rebuild, and I'm just going to raise the number here. So I'm going to set this to maybe something like 10 or 12. Let's say OK, and that just gives us more points in here that we can work with. All right. So now looking at this, we go into our perspective here. It matches up pretty well with the center of this. We want to add some geometry around this, so we can go into rendering and enable that rendering. Change the thickness, maybe take that down a bit. Okay, so we want it to look thick enough to be able to hold this, but not so thick that it looks out of place. Now we can come in and take our connector here, and to access objects inside a group, we can go ahead and just open the group, take our connector, and now we just want to rotate this around, okay, and move it down and just push it into the side here so that we get an area for our cable to connect to. Okay. Push that back in a little bit just so it penetrates in. So we get something like that. And when we're done, we can go ahead and just close that group back up, and there we go. Now for the back end here, I wanted to kind of connect up in here, and this is actually a little bit too narrow maybe. So let's go ahead and open up that group. Okay, and then let's take these two pieces. Okay, and I want to actually add, I want to shape that a little bit. I'm actually going to try to just scale it to get a little bit more room in there. Okay, so we can now put this kind of right in here in that little gap there, I think. Now to maintain our look here, I'm going to actually take all of these and let's just scale those up as well so they fit back in with that space that we've created here. Okay, so just kind of widen that up a bit. Now our curve, we can take the point at the end and just kind of move this around a little bit, move it back in. Okay, And then we need to have a connector here. So I'm going to kind of pull this up into position. Okay. And you can take, if you want it to be completely straight, you can take all of those and kind of move those up a bit. But we want to have another cylinder down here to be able to use. So we'll go to create, let's create some geometry cylinder. Let's use auto grid. We'll draw this on here. And let's pull this out. We can now go to modify. Let's make this an editable poly, and we will select the polygons on the front here. Okay, just something like that, and then we can extrude those in. Okay, so we'll go to edit polygons, extrude, pull those in, and we can do a pretty simple piece here. So we'll take this and let's just kind of scale it down. And so we just want to give it something to look like it's connected in with the main body here. It doesn't have to be exact, just a little piece here. Scale that down a bit and out in the Z so it can extend back into the body there. So maybe something like that, and we could turn that black so we get a connector kind of right in there. Alright, so now we need to create the other side of our racer, and let's go ahead and do that. So we'll take our engine right, and an easy way again to do that would be to use our working pivot, which will just pop that in the middle, and you can move this pivot, but at this point we haven't moved it, and it's right in the center, which is exactly where we want it. And we'll just do a mirror. Make a copy of that. Okay, and we can do the same thing for our cable. Okay. And then we can do the same thing here for this little piece. Move that over, and then if you want to, you can add that to your pod main group. Alright, so here is our pod racer, and so feel free to add any sort of little detail that you want. On the engines, you could add some more bolts and things with your object paint. You can come in and add any of the little pieces that you want to add on the main part of the pod. But just by using, and we saw how we could just use some simple shapes, not only splines but also polygon shapes, primitive shapes that we can modify and use, and then converting those to an editable poly, we're able to modify those manually. So work with the different sub-objects, the vertices, the edges, the polygons themselves, to create some fairly complex geometry for how simple the pieces are that make up this piece. So you can see just by dropping in a number of simple objects in here, you start to get something that looks a little bit more complex, especially if you're starting out. You may look at something like this and not know exactly where to start, but just by taking it slow, looking at some of the shapes that you're building, and using some of the tools that are available here in 3ds Max, you can really start to build up some geometry quickly. So with the modeling portion done, let's go ahead and next we will look at adding some materials, working with materials and working with textures and starting to add some real color to this. We've used kind of the object color to this point, but let's now jump in the next section of this course and look at adding materials and textures. So we'll do that next.